The Fourth Hung King dynasty emerged at a moment when the spiritual foundations, ritual systems, and symbolic universe of Van Lang had already been firmly established by earlier generations. If the first dynasty laid the groundwork for communal consciousness, the second strengthened social cohesion, and the third perfected the system of rituals and symbols, then the fourth marked a phase of expansion and diffusion, expanding settlement space, extending spiritual authority, and deepening the idea of a unified community across a broader landscape. At this stage, Van Lang was no longer merely a collection of communities bound together by shared myths. It was gradually becoming a stable cultural political entity with an internal order. The sense of we was no longer confined to the village or clan, but expanded into an awareness of a shared territory, a living space collectively protected by common ancestors and shared spiritual forces. The Fourth Hung King dynasty witnessed the long-term stabilization of wet rice agriculture. Generations of accumulated experience in water management enabled people not only to resist floods, but to regulate, harness, and coexist with water. Social rhythms became increasingly synchronized with agricultural cycles, giving rise to a clearly defined sacred calendar, seasons of sowing, harvesting, rest, and ritual. Within this context, time was no longer experienced as an abstract flow. It became a structured and remembered cycle. The people of Van Lang began to live by a calendar, even without writing. This calendar was inscribed through ritual repetition, drum rhythms, and recurring festivals. The Fourth Dynasty can therefore be understood as the period in which early Vietnamese society achieved mastery over social time. Sacred space expanded alongside settlement. Whereas earlier rituals had centered on a limited number of ancestral sites, the growing population generated a network of sacred places that mirrored territorial expansion. Each local community maintained its own ritual focal point, a riverside altar, an elevated mound, a mountain foothold, while remaining symbolically connected to the broader sacred axis of Van Lang. These spaces carried both local identity and collective meaning. During this period, the role of the Hung King became increasingly symbolic of unity. The king was no longer merely the leader of a single community, but the embodiment of continuity, linking generations, regions, humans, ancestors, and the spiritual world. Royal authority did not rely on coercion, but on the ability to preserve and harmonize a sacred order that was widely acknowledged. Importantly, this authority remained integrative rather than distant. The king did not stand outside ritual life, nor above the spiritual forces themselves, but served as an intermediary. His role was to keep the rhythm of agriculture, of ritual cycles, and of collective memory. When harmony prevailed, society was seen as aligned with the cosmic order. When disasters occurred, they were interpreted not only as natural events, but as signs that balance required restoration. The Fourth Hung King dynasty also marked an intensified symbolization of daily life. Ordinary activities, planting rice, harvesting, building homes, marriage, acquired ritual meaning. The boundary between the sacred and the everyday blurred. People lived in a world where every action could resonate beyond the individual, reinforcing a sense of responsibility towards the collective and the unseen order. Bronze drums continued to occupy a central position, but their function broadened. Beyond major ceremonies, drums became regional symbols of spiritual authority. Their sound not only summoned deities, but gathered communities and affirmed the presence of shared order across wider territories. Drum iconography also grew more complex. Decorative layers no longer depicted ritual alone, but portrayed society in motion, labor, travel, celebration. This reflects a moment when people began to see themselves as an integrated social system, not merely as participants in a cosmic cycle. The dragon fairy motif during this period was internalized more deeply. It evolved from a myth of origin into a framework of identity. The people of Van Lang understood themselves as belonging simultaneously to water and to mountains, flexible yet enduring. This balanced tension became a guiding principle in social organization and in confronting uncertainty. Water, in the Fourth Dynasty, was no longer only a ritual element. It became the organizing force of settlement. Villages, fields, and pathways oriented themselves around rivers. Water functioned as connector, sustainer, and carrier of memory. Each river flowed not only through land, but through stories, rituals, and collective identity. Mountains, by contrast, served as anchors of long-term memory. They were the dwelling places of ancestors and spiritual guardians, points of stability amid change. The interplay between water and mountain shaped how people located themselves in space, living within constant movement while remaining oriented towards permanence. Another defining feature of this period was the more systematic transmission of memory. Elders, ritual specialists, and spiritual leaders acted as living repositories of history. They did not merely recount the past, they reenacted it through rites, chants, and drum rhythms. History remained alive, continuously renewed in the present. This mechanism allowed Van Lang to maintain social order without writing or codified law. Stability was not enforced through texts, but sustained through shared memory and conscious repetition. The Fourth Hung King dynasty stands as a clear example of a society capable of long-term organization through culture alone. If earlier dynasties laid the foundations, the fourth deepened the civilizational space of early Vietnam. This space expanded not only geographically, but symbolically and conceptually. People no longer simply existed, they understood themselves as existing within a larger order, rooted in the past, enacted in the present, and extending towards the future. From this foundation, subsequent Hung King dynasties could enter more complex phases marked by greater social differentiation, broader interaction, and more significant challenges. Yet it was the Fourth Hung King dynasty that created the cultural depth strong enough to prevent early Vietnamese identity from dissolving under change, allowing it instead to adapt, endure, and persist time over. When the Fourth Hung King dynasty entered a period of stability, Van Lang was no longer merely a society in formation, it had become a complete living world, one in which human beings understood their place within the order of heaven, earth, water, mountains, and ancestors. This was the moment when ancient Vietnamese civilization did not simply exist, but began to develop self-awareness. People of Van Lang at this stage no longer lived day to day as a series of reactions to nature. They had learned how to anticipate, prepare, and remember. Rain was no longer an absolute surprise. Rising waters were no longer only a threat, but a familiar signal within a recurring cycle. This collective capacity for memory marked a critical transition of the Fourth Dynasty, from a society that merely adapted to nature into one that actively harmonized with it. During this period, a clear and systematic spatial order began to take shape. Communities were no longer distributed at random. Settlements aligned themselves along recognizable axes, close to water for daily life, oriented toward mountains for worship, and facing the sun during ritual ceremonies. Living space and sacred space gradually interwove, no longer existing as separate realms. Each village was not only a place of residence, but a unit of memory. Within every community were locations no one dared to violate: ritual grounds, ancient trees, elevated mounds of earth, sacred bends of the river. These places required no fences or written laws. The community instinctively understood that they held ancestral memory and spiritual power. The Fourth Hung King dynasty also marked a shift in ritual life, from centralized to decentralized practice. Grand communal ceremonies still existed, but each village and region developed its own rituals, all referencing the same shared symbolic system. This reveals a high level of social organization. diversity without fragmentation. Within this context, the bronze drums no longer resonated solely at the political or ritual center. They emerged as markers of civilization itself. Where a drum existed, sacred order was present. Where its rhythm was kept correctly, the community was understood to be in harmony. The drum did not need to sound constantly. Its mere presence carried symbolic authority. The sound of the drum in the Fourth Dynasty did more than summon people. It shaped time itself. When the drum sounded, people knew one phase had ended and another had begun. Sacred time no longer flowed freely. It was marked by sound, by rhythm, and by patterns remembered and transmitted across generations. At the same time, the role of ritual keepers became more clearly defined. These were not rulers in a political sense, but individuals with deep collective memory, those who remembered prayers, drum rhythms, ceremonial sequences, and taboos. They served as bridges between past and present, between the living community and ancestral spirits. As a result, the Fourth Han King dynasty required no written law. Law existed within ritual, memory, and the fear of disrupting sacred order. When an individual strayed from communal norms, punishment did not need to be violent. Shame before the community and before the ancestors was sufficient to correct behavior. At a higher level, the Han King himself became a symbol of temporal continuity. The king did not embody military power, but the unbroken flow of Van Lung through time. When the king appeared in major rituals, it was not merely a political act, but a declaration that the past remained alive in the present. Notably, this authority was not personal. A Han King could pass away, but the role of Han King endured. Power had been detached from the individual and anchored instead in symbol and ritual. This represents an early form of institutional thinking, long before the emergence of a state in the modern sense. In everyday life, the division of labor became increasingly distinct, yet this differentiation did not erode communal cohesion. Farmers, hunters, bronze casters, ritual specialists, each role was understood as essential to the collective order. No one stood outside the sacred structure of society. Water during the Fourth Dynasty took on a new meaning, a carrier of memory. Rivers did not merely transport water, they carried stories. Myths, rituals, and invocations were tied to specific stretches of river. As people moved along these waterways, they did not abandon memory, they carried it with them. Mountains, by contrast, functioned as anchors of identity. They did not move or change quickly. In the Van Long worldview, mountains were where ancestors watched over the living, where order remained stable and unshaken. The coexistence of water and mountains in daily life expressed a profound philosophy: to live within constant change, yet never lose one's foundation. During the Fourth Han King dynasty, also witnessed the internalization of the dragon fairy myth. People no longer merely told the story of their origins, they lived by it. They understood themselves as carrying two seemingly opposing qualities: fluid and adaptable like water, enduring and grounded like mountains. This balance allowed the community to survive climate shifts, natural disasters, and internal tensions. Funeral practices from this period further reveal beliefs about continuity. The dead were not separated from the community, they transitioned into another role within the sacred order. Burial goods, small drums, familiar tools, and personal objects were not meant to serve the individual alone, but to affirm that life did not end, it only changed form. Because of this worldview, fear of death was softened. People lived with the awareness that they were links in a long chain connecting ancestors and descendants. This consciousness created extraordinary cultural resilience. Society could change, but it would not dissolve. In this sense, the Fourth Han King dynasty represents a stage in which ancient Vietnamese civilization learned how to sustain itself. Without territorial conquest or coercive control, Van Long maintained unity through shared memory, ritual practice, and symbolic order. From this foundation, later dynasties would face greater challenges: broader cultural exchange, external contact, and internal transformation.
Yet regardless of how forms evolved, the civilizational core had already been secured during the Fourth Dynasty, a worldview in which human life existed in harmony with heaven, earth, ancestors, and community.
When Van Long society under the Fourth Hung King dynasty reached a state of self-sustaining balance, the most important concern was no longer survival or expansion, but how to preserve the order that had been built across many generations. This was the moment when people no longer asked, "How do we live?" but began, silently, without words, to ask, "How do we continue to be who we are?" Within that unspoken question, awareness of collective memory deepened more than ever before. Memory was no longer confined to legends told during long nights or to rare grand ceremonies. It permeated everyday life, in the choice of planting days, in the orientation of houses, in the way mountains and rivers were named and spoken of. The people of Van Long lived inside memory rather than merely remembering it. During the Fourth Dynasty, one can clearly sense the formation of an unwritten moral order. There were no texts and no formal doctrines, yet everyone understood what was right and what fell outside accepted norms. This sense of right and wrong did not originate from a ruling individual, but from a shared belief that every action left a trace within the invisible order of heaven, earth, and ancestors. For this reason, behaviors that disrupted harmony, excessive appropriation, disrespect for ritual, neglect of ancestral memory, were not only opposed by the community, but believed to invite sacred consequences. Natural disasters, failed harvests, or social instability were not seen as random events, but as signs of imbalance between human behavior and the cosmic order. In this context, ritual ceased to be a series of isolated events and became the structural framework supporting the entire society. Ritual defined time, space, and social roles. Through ritual, each individual understood where they belonged, what role they played, and the limits of their position within the collective whole. The Fourth Hung King dynasty was also a period in which silence acquired profound meaning. Silence before the bronze drum, silence at the ritual grounds, silence when invoking the ancestors' names. This silence was not the absence of language, but an acknowledgement of realities beyond verbal expression. It marked a civilization that had moved beyond explanation and entered a stage of contemplation. At a deeper level, an early form of historical consciousness took shape. The people of Van Long did not record events in chronological years, but they clearly distinguished between the time of the ancestors, the time of village founding, the time of opening the land, and the present time. Each period was associated with its own rituals, invocations, and symbols. History, therefore, did not exist along a linear timeline, but as layers of memory overlapping and coexisting. In the Fourth Hung King dynasty, myth was no longer merely a tool for explaining origins, it became a moral framework. The dragon fairy myth did not only answer where people came from, but quietly taught them how to live, how to remain bound together as a community, how to divide without fragmenting, how to travel far without forgetting one's roots. Myth had fully merged with social life. Within this setting, the role of the Hung King grew increasingly symbolic rather than administrative. The king did not need to intervene in each village or region. The mere existence of the Hung King institution provided a supreme point of reference, a center to which all differences could return and be reconciled. Notably, this authority did not rely on distance or separation. The king did not isolate himself through extravagant rituals or inaccessible spaces. On the contrary, the king appeared as part of the shared order, distinguished only by carrying a heavier spiritual responsibility than anyone else. The Fourth Dynasty also witnessed the emergence of clearer regional distinctions without leading to fragmentation. Each region developed its own ritual styles, drum decorations, and versions of ancestral stories, yet all revolved around the same core symbolic system. This reflects a civilization strong enough to allow diversity within unity. In spiritual life, the people of Van Long no longer sought to control nature, but learned to read its signs. Clouds, winds, river currents, bird calls, and changes in the forest were all understood as messages. Misreading these signs was not merely a practical error, but a failure of sacred responsibility. Mountains during the Fourth Dynasty were not only sites of worship, but repositories of the deepest memory. The oldest myths and the most ancient invocations were often tied to mountains. Mountains came to symbolize permanence, while water represented transformation. Human life unfolded between these two poles, learning flexibility without losing its foundation. Funeral practices continued to serve as a central spiritual pillar, yet at this stage, a greater calm toward death is evident. The deceased were not removed from the living community, but understood to transition into another position within the sacred order. This worldview produced a society less destabilized by loss, because death did not rupture the community, it extended it into another dimension. This perspective naturally limited violence. When people believed that every action carried consequences beyond the present lifetime, they became more cautious about harming one another. Social order was therefore maintained not through coercion, but through a sense of intergenerational responsibility. Viewed from this depth, the Fourth Han Qing dynasty was not the most dramatic in terms of events, but it was among the most significant in terms of spiritual structure. It established a foundation strong enough to allow society to endure future upheavals without disintegration. When later dynasties entered periods of exchange, conflict, and profound change, the memory shaped during the Fourth Dynasty would serve as an anchor. No matter how circumstances shifted, people retained a sense of where they belonged within the larger order of heaven, earth, and ancestors. This is why, when looking back at the age of the Hung Kings, Vietnamese people do not merely see a sequence of semi-mythical dynasties. They recognize a deep spiritual foundation, one in which humanity learned how to live together, live with nature, and live with a memory that extends far beyond a single lifetime.